Take it away, Stephen.
All right, first standing item, we're recording, so first standing item is new faces. Anybody here who hasn't been on a call before? I don't see anybody, so moving on to the next thing. Release planning and updates from, guessing, Javier.
Maybe we can start with the lifecycle today. We want to cut a patch release of the lifecycle because there is a broken flag. At the same time, we were looking at making a change that would help us with the trust builder work in pack, which is to, right now, when we drop down from root user to an unprivileged user, in cases where the lifecycle is executed as root, which pack does when it needs to talk to the Docker daemon, there are a couple steps to set up the environment variables that would be needed, but those steps are only needed in the creator phase. It's the only time you would run the lifecycle as root and need to take those actions. So in addition to the flag fix in this patch, we've changed the logic so that it only takes those steps when it's necessary. I don't think either of these should affect people broadly other than fixing creator. But we wanted to give everyone a heads up and a chance to test out the lifecycle. You can try to cut that today unless anyone has major concerns.
Cool. We also probably should mention that we're making some updates to Tekton. It seems like they've updated their API and now they've branched off to, I believe, a V1 beta and a V1 alpha. I think Natalie is working through that. They've also changed their CLA, which is kind of a little bit of a blocker for us. I believe we're getting close to resolving that. But that should come out here relatively soon. That adds the feature where they could now mount the platform volume and add environment variables there.
On the Tekton template thing you're working on, are we switching the Tekton template to use creator so it's kind of easier to understand, or are we keeping it multi-binary?
I haven't done that yet. Emily, do you want to speak to that a little bit?
I think in pack, once we introduce the concept of trusted builders, we're only going to be using creator for trusted builders. So in Tekton, we can't, unless we publish two different templates, we can't perform like a logic like that in order to decide whether to run creator or run it in multi-phases. So it's a trade-off between whether we want the default to be the faster one or the default to be the safer one.
The safety issue is that in the creator case, the creator is coming from the builder itself, and so you don't know if you really where the code came from, right?
Yeah, and once we have lifecycle images, we can harden the Tekton template so the builder image is the only one that gets the credentials. We'll have to do a little bit of magic with the way they mount credentials to prevent them from mounting credentials to every step, which the task wants to do by default. But okay, theoretically, we could make a safer version of the Tekton template, but that is at odds with using the faster version.
That makes a lot of sense. Eventually, we could provide both, right? That seems like it's reasonable. Someone reached out in a Slack channel, I think today, wondering how to use pack with GCB, and it's like the lifecycle is exactly the right fit for GCB because it's basically just Tekton, right? the interface. But there wasn't a good example, and when I point people towards the Tekton example, it's very complicated. It's like a lot of stuff to port over. If there were a really clear example of here's how you use the creator in a cloud platform, right? Like it'd be a great fit for that kind of use case. So really interested in seeing that happen at some point. I think it make it a lot easier for platform implementers who want to start simple with something that uses the platform to do the builds.
I don't think there's any reason we couldn't add two tasks to the Tekton catalog and just in the README describe why you'd choose one or the other.
Makes sense. The other thing about the Tekton template I remembered recently is there was a PR into that template for support for OpenShift has some weird limitation that required a privileged container to run at the beginning. And we decided that we don't want any of those things to run in privileged containers because it's kind of the point. Is that something we're looking at, or we can do that separately?
I PR'd in a reversion to that change and was sort of asking for the context as to, I was confused because they're saying it was caused by a security feature of OpenShift, but I think requiring things that don't need to be privileged doesn't sound like a security feature to me, but that conversation hasn't resolved yet. I need to get back to them.
Cool, thanks. Anything else on release planning? Javier, any updates on pack? Nope. Cool.
Still on track. Yep.
Review RFCs. I'm going to share my screen and we'll just go one by one. I think we decided last time that we wanted to do this really quickly. Just go one by one and ask for a status update or see if anybody knows what's going on with each one. Is that right? And we're not doing specs or drafts, or not doing spec PRs, or we're skipping draft RFCs. Is that correct?
Yeah, there should be just the active RFCs in that README that you should be able to click. That should only limit it to what we want to go over.
Oh, I see. Is there a way I can filter this? I'll just skip the draft ones. Publish a build pack with pack. Joe.
Yeah, let's talk about this after we go through all of them. Does that sound good?
Sounds good. Process-specific environment variables.
I asked Dave Sire to contribute some examples. This was the furthest he was willing to go. He was somewhat indifferent to the possible success of this issue, so I don't know if we want to abandon it or...
Yeah, I think Ben mentioned actually this would be one of our first RFCs that we were going to propose to close.
Yep.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely. Like unless you want to adopt this, the original poster isn't going to follow through on it.
It's a really straightforward, non-breaking change that adds something that's, like seems pretty reasonable, or like I could definitely see a need for this coming up in the future.
Are you planning on adopting it?
Thinking about
the RFC?
Thinking about it. Yeah. Does anybody feel like we shouldn't do this, I guess, is my question. I'd be willing to implement it. I don't know if I'm willing to, push hard that it needs to happen immediately if there's resistance to doing it.
I don't have resistance. It's more of just, I was just interested in like more around motivation than anything than what it is. Like,
yeah,
kind of.
The use case, to my understanding, is that right now we create process types like web or worker or, sidecar, or maybe just need to do database migrations using the image, right? You can set environment variables that run when those processes run, but you can't do that for each process. They all apply to all process types. So this just lets you use directories inside of these, which are previously not permitted, to represent which process type the environment variable applies to. So if you have your database migration that needs to run with a different environment, then your worker needs to run with a different environment than your web process, right? It's really easy to do that.
Yeah, we see this in Heroku sometimes too, where like someone will run sidekick workers, like 3 different workers for 3 different queues and 3 different and you have to use envars that are prefixed certain ways to kind of get around this, right? Because otherwise they start inheriting the envars from your very first worker.
Me, I think it makes sense and would be a good feature. The only open question is about ordering. Like right now we apply all the environment modifications in the order of build package section and then lexically within the environment. I guess like what would happen if there was there's some edge cases. It's like, what if there's an environment variable in env, but also a different one in process? Can the process specific one override the env one, stuff like that? But nothing insurmountable.
To me, the order of priority is already kind of implied by the decisions we've made in the spec. So the more specific ones would always override, and then the lexical ordering and the build pack ordering is already predefined.
So we'd apply all the ends that aren't specific to a process, and then after that, run through all the process ones.
Yeah.
That makes sense to me.
I don't want us to get too caught up on this. I just wanted to know if there was a whole bunch of resistance to it, and it doesn't seem like there is. So I'm going to leave it open, and I may try to drive it through. Might not happen super quickly, but I think.
Are you going to take over ownership of the RFC then?
Do I do that? So we have a process for, isn't it just, well, I guess
I assume you can just open a new RFC with your changes on top of his.
Yeah, and then I'll close this one, but I won't close it until I open the other one, so it is active. Yeah, okay. One more thing. So after that, we have RFC for the export report TOML.
I just had some. I think I was the last one who's comment on it, but I was mostly just driving that we should close out kind of the unresolved questions, whether they're out of scope because we want to move this forward versus just leaving them dangling.
Yeah,
which is probably regional.
I can move some of the questions I posed in it to be explicitly out of scope of this RFC. I think the one outstanding question for me was, I'm not opposed and might even like some additional metadata, which I think I proposed as a possibility. But if there's not a lot of interest for it or concern around it, I'd probably move it out of scope like you suggested, Terrence.
I mean, I didn't have a lot of additions or changes to your proposal where you, I think, CC'd me on the comment, but I guess I was hoping Stephen would chime in.
Do you have some specific questions for me?
Just this comment there, I think.
Yeah, what you're currently on.
Do you have thoughts on what layer info might look like in report TOML? Oh, I see.
I feel strongly that it shouldn't duplicate information that's on image labels. It's like everything that isn't on an image label, kind of, or the key you need to look up the image to get the labels.
I agree with that. The idea behind this was to capture like an aggregate of the layers, some of which might not be available on image metadata. For example, like what you did with it. Did you use a cache? Did you not? Did you save it?
Yeah.
It seems useful, but if other people don't actually care about it, I'd probably remove it from the report or the RFC.
I have no opinion. I don't even have a strong opinion on whether or not there's duplicated data between the two places.
If no one has a strong opinion on it, I'm kind of inclined to not make it part of this RFC.
Yeah, I'm fine just moving it out of scope. I mean, I'm personally interested in that data, but maybe other people aren't. I was always under the impression that Stephen wanted to have more data around layer usage, but apparently not.
What do you mean more data around layer usage?
Well, just like being like a platform being able to report out, like having a place to grab this stuff to be able to report out, like even as pack or something, right? Like, oh, like we built this image and with their support, you like a platform like pack or Evergreen or something could actually like format out a thing that is readable to users of like the image that was being built.
And the idea is that it's hard for a platform to read that off of the image that was built in the end, or that I thought the question is just, should we duplicate stuff here that's in the image labels?
I think the idea behind this sort of metadata is additional metadata about the build that may not be available on the metadata. So for example, some layers aren't exported, right? Cache-only layers. If a platform wanted to have any information about that, perhaps the report could contain some metadata about what those layers were or what they were used for. And that's the sort of thing export and caching does, but isn't necessarily available on the metadata layers, if that's useful to some platforms.
So it seems like there's no drawback to putting information about each layer that's not going to be put in the image metadata into the file here, and nobody is opposed to doing that.
I think that's true, but I'm kind of reluctant to make that part of this RFC because it doesn't seem the best way to drive features forward. That everyone seems just like, okay. I think I'd rather just add in the data that I'm originally proposing in the report. And then when there's actual real use case for this layer metadata, someone could drive that through.
There's another RFC open that will probably go through on this list about adding metadata about build-only layers to the image itself. And the author of that RFC just reached out to me today to say that he's going to show up next week. I do wonder if there's some overlap between these two things because it includes metadata for non-launch layers. And then whether that goes in a report or that gets added to the image as well is interesting. I wonder if, I'm sort of inclined to say, let's do the small part of this we know we want, and we can have a bigger conversation about what's missing and open more.
So it seems like some of this may actually go into the image, and so for now, cut it out, but it's still maybe useful information at some point, and we can bring it back in another RFC. Cool. Anything else on this one?
If anyone wants to start approving it, I might complain.
Sounds good.
Can you make a note of that, Emily, in that RFC under that question?
Yeah, that I think it has overlap with the other one.
Yep.
And then I'll add those out of scope data that you mentioned, Terrence.
All right. Moving on to the next one, custom CA certs. Do I see Xander here? I don't think I see him. This is kind of tied into the stack extensions thing, which means it's kind of tied into, how there's been a lot of discussions about how modular that should be and what that should look like recently. I think there's going to be more discussion on what this looks like, and just continue to stay open for now. Any questions or comments on that one?
No, I will mention that as far as I'm aware, he's also looking into alternatives to the one proposed in the RFC regarding volume or volume mounts, and using that. And I think he's trying to reach out to Emily and you, Stephen, to try to see if we could get that hashed out before incorporating it into the RFC.
Yep, we're going to chat today.
Cool.
Anything else on that one? Seems like no, we talked about this one. He's going to show up to the working group meeting in a week or two. Synchronized GitHub repo labels.
This is an FCP last week, so unless there are outstanding comments since then, I think we can close and merge.
All right, somebody want to own merging this? Going once?
Sure thing. Happy to.
All right. Awesome. Release process, RFC. Javier.
I don't think there's been any.
Status of this. I think this is ready to get merged in, but what's the last comment?
Approved 6 days ago, now has full approval from everybody. So did we ever formally put this in FCP, or should we do that right now?
Just do it right now, I guess.
FCP as of 2020-506 will be merged. When, how long does FCP last?
Just 1 week.
So that's
Basically next Wednesday we should merge.
13 assuming no other feedback is presented, something like that. Good. And last one is app image extensions. This is really active. Joe maybe may want to propose a pretty different UX to this, and there's still a lot of open discussion about what that UX might look like. It's definitely a need that people have called out as important that we should look into as soon as possible, or keep discussion. Anything we want to talk about today? All right, seems like that was all the RFCs that are open.
I did want to circle back to the first one.
Oh, right.
Yeah, the pack polish.
Yep, you want to present this?
Sure.
I'm gonna stop sharing.
So we talked about this, I think, last Thursday, so that probably means not everybody saw it. So at a high level, the client-side Buildpack Registry RFC was a little hand-wavy about the implementation of actually publishing to Buildpack Registry. And so this RFC is meant to just flesh out the details with how that works and what the actual spec is for that. When I presented it last week, it was somewhat simplified in that the pack, you can see it's proposing two commands, pack publish build pack and pack yank build pack. Publish build pack would actually open a browser to create a GitHub issue with all the body and the title and everything filled out for you. And then a bot would see that issue and turn it into a commit on the repository. So sort of leveraging GitHub's identity so that we don't have to manage our own database of users and passwords and stuff, or even single sign-on. And then just also kind of control like a clearinghouse for the registry, checking ownership and things like that. There were some concerns about how that would work if you wanted to fork the registry, because right now the registry design is such that you can the index is stored in a Git repository. You can fork that GitHub repo. You can set up your own registry very easily, but the pack publish build pack command would not work. So what I updated this to include was 4 different mechanisms for publishing build pack, just based on flags that are passed to publish build pack. The default is still what I described, and it is sort of a special case. But I'm saying that we will actually check the registry URL that's being used. And if it does not match the official registry, this won't work. It'll give you a message on how you should publish or something along those lines. So we're saying very much a special case for the official registry. In the future, maybe we have an actual registry and we're not like just piggybacking off of GitHub. But this doesn't prevent us from doing that in the future. The 2 other mechanisms for publishing are headless, which last week I described as like programmatically via the GitHub API opening an issue, the same issue that you would open in the browser. But I've changed that a bit to be a little bit more generic, where it just makes a post request to a URL with a JSON payload, which is the same JSON defined in RFC 22, the client-side Buildpack Registry RFC. This would mean that we would need to run like a little proxy that received this request and then transformed it for the official Buildpack registry, and then transformed it into the API call to create the GitHub issue. So there is a little bit of like on-call burden, so to speak, for it, but this wouldn't necessarily be on the critical path. You could always go in to GitHub and just create the issue yourself, or use the other, go do it through the browser. So I feel like that's not very critical path and doesn't worry me personally.
Does this mean you're giving your GitHub token to the proxy? So then it's like is that a workflow that GitHub is generally okay with? Is like users sending their tokens to third parties and then doing things on their behalf?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, possibly there's like a redirect thing we could, no, because I don't know how you'd be off. I don't know if there's any way around that if we want this to also work with generic registry, right? Like if I am acme.co and I like want to set up my own registry and I want pack publish build pack to work with it, this is the generic mechanism. So I'm not sure what we would do about that. There's another implication here in that we would need to separate the registry URL into a read and write URL, because the read URL today is just a URL to the Git repository, and this is not going to. This is an HTTP post, right? So it's a different protocol, needs a different URL. So we'd actually have to store those 2 bits of configuration. We'll come back to that because I think there's a lot to discuss there. The third one, I'm not sure how I feel about, is like native, where it actually commits to the local Git repository and then does a Git push. This would not work. This would, like by definition, fail with the official registry. But this seems like something that would be very useful for people that want to maintain their own registry. All right, so those are the changes. I think that's it. So I think this is probably the most contentious part.
I would probably not be willing to trust a service with my GitHub tokens or whatever. I don't know.
Yeah, makes sense.
I wonder where you defined like your registry in the configuration file. If you could add the different endpoints, like the definition of what the registry looks like, right? And you could add the endpoint for the read URL, the write URL, and maybe the type where it's like GitHub, and then it could just, kind of going back to that modular implementation that we talked about, where if it's the GitHub type, we know exactly how to use that, make that API request using the token, and then that way there is no, intermediate service.
Yeah, so it would have different behaviors for the different types. I mean, yeah, that seems interesting. It does. I mean, there's a little bit more burden in the code on like supporting those different paths, I think. But it might also get a little ambiguous. I could see having a GitHub URL that you didn't want to go through the same like GitHub Actions, GitHub new issue flow that I'm proposing here. So you might need like maybe that's just a Git repo at the end of the day then, but.
Is it possible to expose a plugin interface so that people could ship a plugin for Pack to go alongside their registry to support their registry type? Would remove the burden from our code base.
Yeah, maybe. I'm not sure what that would look like, but that seems pretty sane.
I think we should.
Go ahead, Javier.
I was going to say, I think we should take it into consideration, but at the same time, maybe we should make sure that we stay within scope because nobody's really asking for that, right? We just want to make sure that we take it into consideration to propose the solution, but not necessarily think of every single detail within those implementations.
I was going to suggest we could do a more traditional OAuth 2 flow where you reach out to if we're going to create a service that's fronting this anyways, you reach out and it gives you like a redirect, and then you reach out there and log in and then come back with your token. Like that would
Yeah,
work for GitHub and any other Auth2 provider, right?
Is that really headless though? Like, could you do that from like a CI server?
I think
I
the
think so,
personal
yeah.
access token is your way around the OAuth dance, but it's something that's explicitly designed by, or explicitly done, and that token is revocable, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I wonder if GitHub app like installations can help here. Like, I wonder if we could like talk directly to a GitHub installation where, you know, the C&B community, we create our own, you know, installation, and then you could create your own installation to talk to. So then you can restrict to different repositories and things like that. I wonder if there's some way to use that.
Yeah. I think the main thing I'm interested in right now is not boxing out I want to stand up my own registry case. And so I don't even care about implementing the other mechanisms as much as implementing this first one where it opens in the browser, and then leaving space for us to develop those other things in the future as like that need comes along, where people actually want to stand up their own registry and can't just, you know, do their own git push or whatever. I don't know if that adds context.
I think that makes sense. I think having the official one, and then as long as we have the workaround of doing like local commits, like you can still stand up your own registry. You might have to write your own GitHub actions to do some of the things that we're doing. But as long as your published build pack can create local commits, then I feel like that's probably good enough to start with.
Are we comfortable with this default path, like only working for the official registry? Is that a problem?
I mean, I think I was the one who raised concern last week. I don't think any of that has changed, but
I mean,
maybe I'm the only one who.
Could you have it be configurable to any GitHub repo with the pack CLI, and then it's not like the default value that's set in config toml is the.
Yeah, sure you can. It's just that you wouldn't. There's no like guarantee that they have the GitHub actions set up. But, like, it could just be a GitHub repo with no special behavior associated with it, right?
Or then, not GitHub at all, right?
Well, I mean, you could have it like, yeah, no, that's right. If it's not a Git, like, you could extend this to any GitHub repo, but yeah, it would be limited to that. It can't just be like arbitrary Git URL.
I don't have a problem with it being specific to the projects one. It just seems like it doesn't necessarily have to be, if we're willing to say, like, you know, yeah, you could put something else in config toml and then it'll work with that, assuming you run the special version of our GitHub repo and install all these actions, you know. But that's not, you know, creating your own, because actions are part of the source configuration for the registry. If you've used actions, it's in there. You can make a template registry that you can just fork in your GitHub repo. You'll get all the actions across along with the you know, it doesn't seem that hard to make it easy to set your own thing up.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I am a little, have some reservations of tying everything to GitHub. Not like our specific registry, but just like standing up a mirror of a registry requires you to, obviously it doesn't like require you to, because you can work around it at the end of the day. But if everything we do is centered around GitHub, I feel like that's something a blocker for certain enterprises.
I think the direct push workflow, not the one that requires a token, but the one where you know, you're authenticated, you have some permission to push to the repo, might be suitable for those private registry. Like what we're creating here is a public registry authenticated using GitHub, right? So it's going to be tied into GitHub for some of those workflows, but the later workflow where you can just push the commits directly seems like it would cover a lot of those enterprise situations.
And so we're thinking about the second option, keeping that out of scope for now, and then potentially, thinking of using that same plugging mechanism that we have between both those two options to provide or allow other people to propose their own options or solutions. Does that sound right?
I should actually ask a question, not in our back channel. What's the Rust prior art on this? Right, like Rust
just
hosts a
me in
registry
general.
like this. Yeah.
I think
I'll
it's the
ask it for
prior
Kendra.
art that every other language ecosystem does is they stand up a service, because then the API is like you get to control what the API is. And I think the kind of the catching point is that we don't want to operate and run a service. And so like we're kind of trying to pull together stuff where like you don't necessarily want to, for instance, enforce someone to stand up a registry, be like, well, you must implement like GitHub Issues API like on your own to then like have a registry, right? So I think that's kind of where the complication is.
How does the Rust tooling allow you to populate a private registry without all of this other stuff?
I mean, you stand up, running your own registry is like literally running the service, right? So you run a service that has a Git repo that backs it, right? But the service has a predefined API that Cargo basically interfaces with, right? I think this is how like pretty much almost every language ecosystem does it. It's like you have some API that you can define, and therefore it is now standardized across the ecosystem. Whereas we're trying to kind of not do that, but
yeah, and you make the registry service itself, that API, self-hostable if you wanted to.
Exactly. Yep.
When we were thinking about examples last week, the only one that really just used Git is Homebrew, but they don't provide a mechanism for publishing. Oh, we didn't talk about that one, but yeah. I wonder if we could do this in phases. Like maybe the service is the right thing in the end, but also it would be really great to be able to launch some of these features earlier before we have a version of that running and define everything that goes into it.
Yeah, it's something we talked about last week, I think, too, was just like probably like if the project's successful enough that we probably would stand up a service. But
like just because we pick a lighter weight version now doesn't preclude doing something better in the future.
I think that was Michelle's advice recommendation at Summit last year or whatever, right? Was that Helm got really far with, will just setting up a Git repo?
Yeah.
Isn't it still a Git repo?
Yeah.
They made it to graduation, just a Git repo, so just putting that out there.
Yeah, I think that really is my goal. So it's really about, I guess, are we comfortable with an RFC that is hand wavy around that path and just leaves space for the sort of headless one? And then we address the browser-based and native Git paths only. And that would be ideal for me because that's kind of the part that we're struggling with and is sort of blocking moving forward on implementation.
So I think what I heard. Go ahead, Emma.
We even call it out in unresolved questions. Be like, these are all the problems this doesn't solve. We acknowledge they need to be solved. We'll come back to it.
Do you know how the Helm chart stuff works? Of how people stand up their own?
Not really, but I'd be willing to look into that. That's probably a good prior art research. Okay, so let's do this. Yeah, I will look into Helm because that's interesting. And then I think I might try to gut the headless option here in a way that leaves space for whatever, it's a plugin mechanism or something, or just we're running a service or whatever it may be. We can just deal with that in the future.
Did we not have a headless option that did not include a service? The only reason why I asked that is because we're probably going to want to publish right through CI systems, and not having that initially is going to.
That's true, and it was the just using the GitHub API and going like directly rather than through the janky service proxy thing or whatever. Yeah, I mean, it's still worth trying to do that. I'm just not sure how to fit that in without like sort of boxing out a more generic like HTTP post thing that any service could implement. I don't want to have to like be tied to the GitHub API for the rest of time.
Yeah, I mean, we could iterate on that in the future, right? We could always come up with the next solution of the registry interface, or a proper registry interface, I should say. Yeah,
and potentially they'll break people, which would be, if we're doing that, it's because it's successful, and then I really wouldn't want to break people.
I guess the complication is if everyone now implements that thing, like what do you do when you actually want to create something that isn't tied to that, right?
All right, cool. Well, I am comfortable moving forward on it. So unless you want to just keep discussing it, I'll just take another round.
All right. Should we move on to the next thing on the agenda?
I just put the Google thing on here because David mentioned it in the channel.
Sorry, I lost the Google Doc. Next thing on the agenda is
that Google announced a preview of their Google Cloud Platform Buildpacks.
Right.
I guess the kind of interesting note beyond Google having Buildpacks is that they also started working on a DEVMODE mechanism that kind of works with Scaffold, but it's interesting that they have a thing where the Buildpacks output kind of information to the tool, metadata which says which files to watch and where to sync them in the container.
This is kind of similar to, we had someone from Tilt give a demo of Buildpacks working with Tilt. I think it was last week. It'd be interesting to compare those two approaches and try to come up with a generic bin develop that kind of satisfies everybody's needs. I think, Forrest, you were looking into that a little bit. We had a chat this morning about it. Guess you don't have much to share here yet, but it's definitely something that's being actively looked into.
Yeah, and we've been doing stuff on the Salesforce side. Jesse's kind of been leading that effort.
It really feels like we could use some subject interest groups to kind of break out and talk about some of these items. You know, I'm starting to feel like there are some groups of people that are interested in different things in different places that could meet up occasionally and talk about them in an organized way. But maybe we save that topic for next time.
Like a task force or something? Working group?
Subject, isn't that what SIG, you know, it's like that format kind of exists for. Cool. Anything else?
There's something about a Zoom recording
announcement.
Yeah.
Did someone put that in there? I looked at the link and it's great.
I put it in there. So VMware have started putting this thing on automatically at the start of Zoom calls, and it might be worth doing, but I don't know who has the right admin rights to be able to do that for us.
We're going to switch over to the VMware Zoom instance from the Pivotal Zoom instance when they cut cut off the pivotal zoom instance. So that should get automatically set up, and we'll have the password and the link and all that stuff.
Okay.
Yeah, this actually solves the discussion we had in the leadership meeting before this about how we announce it to people. It's now a shrink wrapped EULA that you have to agree to be recorded to even get into the recording. So I think that plus an automatic recording is everything we needed to do.
Perfect.
But we're going to have to remove Emily's emoji.
Didn't work anyways. I was like, if I put this really obnoxious thing, no one will miss it, but it wasn't true.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah.